This is Spectrum Vivaria. In this video, I'm going to do a technical breakdown and full tour of this huge rainforest reptile vivarium that I made. I'm doing this as a follow-up to my Vivarium Build video, which I made as my first upload to this channel. There was so many questions that people had about that build, and it only felt right to do a more thorough, in-depth video of that to present that to all of you. To make things easier, I'll add timestamps to the description of this video so you can reference it for yourself and what exact element of the build that you want to learn about, or just for your reference to come back and see it another time. I will also try and include my tips and suggestions as to what you should be thinking about when you decide to build a big vivarium like this. I feel like a lot of you have come to this video and the previous Vivarium Build video looking for inspiration, ideas, tips, that type of thing, and you'll find a lot of that not just in these videos but on my channel in general, so please consider subscribing and check it all out. Okay, so the first step, of course, in building a vivarium like this is to plan it well. You want to have the considerations of the species that you're intending to keep as the most important priority for a build. This might look like a pretty aesthetic and pleasing build, which I believe it is, but there was a lot of compromises that have to be made to make sure that it's tailored to what I'm keeping and that it's fulfilling the function of what it should be, which is keeping an animal in captivity and giving it all it's required to be healthy and thrive. In my case, I have these blue tree monitors here, which really needed a lot of space, and they definitely needed to have a decent amount of height in here as well. So in combination with a decent size width too, I've been able to create a lot of climbing space and things that they need to thrive. The enclosure is about 6 feet tall, 5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet front to back, or the depth. I went as big as I possibly could for this build so that I would also be able to, when I relocate, be able to have the enclosure leave my apartment here. So I measured all my doorways and the elevator and all of that sort of thing to make sure that I would be able to get the enclosure out when the time comes. Something that I really suggest to do if you are building something like this, and it can even be for smaller vivariums too, but I used Google SketchUp to help visualize how I wanted the frame and the plywood panels to meet each other and create the structure, and that was really helpful. It was a lot quicker than trying to just sketch out and see. For example, for this build, I didn't want any of the end grain of the plywood to be facing the front, so I was able to see using Google SketchUp what those dimensions should be for each piece and as it meets. That is something you need to keep in mind. It's not like measuring just a normal sides of a box, but you know, depending on if you're going to have the plywoods stacked this way or this way, it's going to determine the sizes of all the pieces. So you need to have those sort of things in mind when you're planning too. The enclosure is made out of plywood and wooden beams. I believe there was untreated pine. I definitely would not use treated pine for a vivarium like this. And basically I built the frame using 70mm, or I think it's about 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch wooden beams, and then attached the plywood using screws as well. I went with quite a large frame, probably a little bit overkill, but it was really helpful in the process to have all of that wood, because it meant that you wouldn't have as much of a problem with screws hitting each other. You could be a lot more mindful in that way and not have screws protrude out by accident. You know, these things can happen. I'm not exactly a qualified carpenter. I'm just a reptile keeper with access to power tools, like I'm sure a lot of you are too. But it also made it really good for mounting and such as well. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but the frame at the front is also being used to mount some of the jungle vines that I made. To put the frame together, I used 120mm screws. As I said, the framing was 70 by 70. I felt like using something bigger than that was a bit excessive, so what I did was that I kind of pushed the screw in a little bit into the initial frame so that half of it, being 60 millimeters, would be in the receiving frame piece, and 60 millimeters would be on the initial piece that's meeting together like this. To attach the plywood panels to the frame, I used 50 millimeter screws, and I spaced them about 50 to 80 millimeters apart as well. I did them a little bit closer for the bottom, especially just because that would be the panel that would probably be under the most pressure in terms of weight once it was completed. Each screw was pushed into the plywood slightly so that wood putty could be added on top of them. Once the wood putty was dried, it was sanded down to be flush with the plywood. After staining and sealing the plywood, the screws were now no longer visible. For this vivarium, I had to put it on wheels just because of its sheer size, and it just made sense. Not only because of the weight of the vivarium and how big it is, it's obviously very, well, it's impossible to move on your own if you don't have wheels. And it also served a second purpose as well, which was to lift it from the floor so that I could attach a drainage system for this, but we'll talk more about that later. I also made cutouts for extra air ventilation on the side panels on the upper area. Might be able to see it here somewhere. I think it might be blocked by that vine, but I have them on either side, and I also have them underneath the glass here on this plywood panel as well. Currently I have them closed, and that's another aspect of this build which was really important, is that I'm controlling humidity in this. These blue tree monitors, they need humidity essentially. They're a rainforest species, so it's really important that if you do have a vivarium that you want to keep humid, I highly recommend that you make it so the ventilation can be opened and closed. Everybody's situation is going to be different in that way. I now live in a country that has a full 4 seasons, and particularly in the winter, the air just gets so damn dry. So I have to have those closed up, and it's obviously a little bit colder too. So being able to close and open those vents is just, again, it's another saver in terms of making my life easier with this vivarium setup. So having vents that you can open and close, really good idea if you have humid loving reptiles. For the air vent covers, all I did was I added some small pieces of plywood on either side, and I created a strip of plywood that would roughly cover the front of that vent. And what I did was I put window seal on that piece of plywood and then put locks on either side so that it could be clamped on and there would be a proper seal, and then it can also be taken off at whim anytime I feel like it. Right now I actually have the bottom ones closed up and just the top ones open as it's summer and it's quite hot, so that those need to be open, and the humidity levels are a little bit better in summer too. I also made nest and hide boxes, so I had to cut out the side panels a little bit so that I would be able to have boxes inside but have access from outside of the vivarium. The hide and nest boxes was something that I really wanted to try. It's not something I'd really seen done in this way before, so I really wanted to give it a go and see how it was. Basically all I did was I built boxes using the same plywood, and I did those to the dimensions that some plastic storage boxes could fit inside. That way, instead of the animals just going into these boxes and when you open from the outside it's exposed, it's that they actually go into these plastic storage boxes inside of the nest boxes, so that way they're enclosed, they can't jump out. And also for the nest box, that I can have a deep substrate in there, and then have it be able to remove it when I need to. The entrances of those boxes are basically just PVC pipes that go through the wall of the box and of course the background as well, and then they protrude out within the boxes where I've cut a hole in the plastic boxes, so then they can just slide into that. So when they enter the PVC pipe entrance, they can only go into the plastic box. And the doors for those nest and hide boxes are pretty basic. There's just some plywood that I've used with some small aluminium hinges and some hasp lock with keys. Once the main construction was completed of the frame, the plywood panels and then the nest boxes, I had to seal the wood and seal the enclosure before we do anything more. So what I used was a polyurethane based wood sealer. I used one that actually had a mahogany stain for the outside, and I believe I did 2 coats with the mahogany. One was a little bit too light, and once I'd done that, I then went with the clear polyurethane sealer. To seal the inside was a little bit different. I did use a clear polyurethane sealer with added water resistance, but I would not recommend using that on its own. For this one, in addition to doing that, I used a lot of it for the bottom. So I had a lot of excess, and I actually pulled it in many layers on the bottom, a lot more than you would get just from brushing it on. In addition to that, I used silicone on all edges within the inside of the vivarium, aquarium grade silicone, so it's animal safe too. For further water protection on top of what I'd already done, I then used expanding and extruded polystyrene foam to then seal the bottom, and then on top of the foam, I sealed it with a masonry waterproofer, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the rock wall background. But I wouldn't recommend this method for you to replicate, simply because it feels a little bit more risky in terms of getting it done right, as opposed to using an epoxy or a pond liner method. So I don't really recommend that you do it that way, but because I presented what I did here, I wanted to give that a bit of an explanation. There was a lot of questions in the comments for that original vivarium build video about how I did the glass. That was the one step that I didn't film, and I very much regret it, but I was in a rush and all of that, and it was just, I didn't think there would be so much interest in it, but apparently there was, so let's talk about it. Basically all it is you've got these large sliding glass doors, and they sit on an aluminium track both on the bottom and the top, which kind of just isn't really for weight support but just as a guide. And the glass themselves, they have an aluminium trim along the bottom. Within this aluminium trim there are wheels that sit on this track, so the glass can actually slide effortlessly. As you can see, I can just move it with 1 or 2 fingers and it's no problem, and these are big heavy pieces of glass. So basically all I had to do to get these was I went to my local glazier or glassmaster, whatever you call it where you're from, and I told them the size of the opening here for what I wanted to do. I showed them pictures on Google of the style that I wanted, and they basically fixed everything. They cut the glass to the right size, they added the aluminium trim on the bottom, and then I also bought the tracks from them too. They had double-sided tape on them, so it was as simple as sticking the tracks on the top and the bottom, and then just sitting them on top. Really easy. An advantage of using sliding doors like this is that you get quite a lot of ventilation from it too. So the gap between the pieces in the middle goes all the way up here. So you're actually getting quite a lot of ventilation. It's something that a lot of people overlook when they're doing their vivariums, but like I said before about ventilation, it's always good to have lots of options and to be able to open and close. So that's why I actually have the vents closed at the bottom, because with the gaps that I have in the glass and then the vents at the top, it's working quite well in that way, but I have the option to open it if I need to. Another happy little accident was that there are small handles on the bottom. I'll try to put a shot here so you can see. And they kind of make sure that the glass doesn't quite touch the edge of the frame here. And that's kind of a happy little accident, like I said, because now if I'm opening and closing, look, I'm always really careful when I do it, but it means that any tails or claws, they're not going to get squished or pancaked against it if something were to happen. So that's, and again, it adds some extra ventilation, and because it's so large, you're getting ventilation both in the upper, the middle, and the lower third as well. I don't know the exact name of this style of sliding glass door, but maybe if you Google aluminium sliding glass door cabinet, you should be able to find something that's similar to this. I believe that this style is more used for glass cabinets and such, like in stores, because you can actually have a lock that's added into the aluminium bottom trim as well. Alright, so now for the part that I'm sure a lot of you are really interested in, and that is how I created the rock wall background for this vivarium. First, what I did to create a medium from which to carve and create this rocky kind of landscape in the background here is I used expanding foam to then stick and adhere pieces of extruded polystyrene foam to all of the walls and the outside of the nest and hide boxes to remove the shapes of not just the nest and hide boxes but of the overall flatness of the sides of the vivarium. I did this by sticking many layers together and having a rough idea of the kind of shape and considerations that I wanted. So for my animals, I wanted ledges that they could sit on at different heights. In particular, where I would put the nest and hide boxes, I wanted that to be some basking platforms. So these needed to be not too close to where my lamps and such would be. I needed an appropriate distance from there. So these are the sort of things that you have to have in consideration when you're planning and trying to do it. To create that shape, once all the XPS foam was stuck on there, I just used a variety of different tools. Mainly I just stuck to using different types of knives, just small kitchen knives, and also a box cutter. That was really good for the finer details in terms of, you know, you get the bulk out with the larger knives, and then the box cutter was really good for going over the edges a couple of times just to kind of give it a bit more of a detailed look and to remove any small little excess pieces that were not so formed on the surface after hacking it with the larger knife. When you're carving, what I suggest to do is to try and remove the edges and the flat surfaces first. It can be really hard to visualize what you want when everything looks so square and geometric. So removing all those kind of edges and flatness really helps a lot. I tried to cut it at different angles. I had this kind of angular approach. I wanted to create this depth and this layering to the rock. You can particularly see it on this side here. But just trying to get that shape and not keeping everything in one plane or in one kind of direction. Because I was cutting kind of like this as I was going, having a general direction towards kind of one way. In terms of exactly how it would look, it can be kind of hard to know. You have a general idea, but really you just need to build up that medium to carve from and to just start hacking at it and then seeing how the shapes evolve and come into creation, I guess. As you hack, you'll see areas where, oh, you should take a little bit more from there to create that ledge, or you'll see, maybe I've taken too much away here, and then you can just use expanding foam and more XPS if you need to just bulk that area out again and to just carve it out a little bit better. When I'm using the expanding foam for something like this, I found that using an expanding foam gun was a lot better than just buying the expanding foam in a can, which has the kind of plastic straw. I found that you had a lot more control as far as how much of the foam comes out. You can press it very gently or more for more or less of the foam to come out. And it was also good once the foam was hacked up that I could then precisely add some extra expanding foam because sometimes as you were hacking you would create these small holes between the different layers, and of course you want to try and fill those up before you seal it. Now that the foam has been shaped, carved and prepared, it was time to seal it, and the way that I did that was I used latex-based original Drylok masonry waterproofer. That was a bit of a mouthful, but I wanted to make sure that I named the product correctly. They have a few different products, but the one that you want is the latex-based original Drylok, because the others are not animal safe, whereas this one is. The reason I went with this method was because using something like cement would have made this enclosure a lot heavier, and I wanted to try and avoid that, and I felt like for the size of animals that I was going to have in here, that the Drylok method should work quite good. What I also really liked about this method was that it preserved the carving really well in the foam. If you use the cement or grout methods, you lose a lot of that detail. So I was able to do a lot of these details before I did any sealing. To seal the foam, it takes about 5 to 6 layers of the Drylok to get a kind of hardness and durability to it that feels good to use in a vivarium like this. It really becomes quite durable and has this rocky texture, and it's quite hard, and it actually works really well. The animals are not able to break through that wall at all. I can clean it, you know, for the upper areas, you know, when it comes to cleaning, I can just use like a toothbrush or other small cleaning brush. The Drylok comes in white usually, and what I do is I add a pigment powder to it to get a more desirable color. You can do this from the beginning. In my build video, I actually started with just white, but I realized you know, going forward that was not really necessary. You can dye the Drylok from the very beginning and make your life a little bit easier. To achieve this color with the Drylok, I used iron oxide pigment to add a dye and color that white Drylok. The iron oxide is a black pigment, and of course adding it to white, it's not going to turn it completely black. It becomes this kind of darkish gray, and I was quite fond of that color, so I just stuck to that. Also, something I want to talk about is the floor again. I talked about how I used the polyurethane sealer and the silicone along the bottom there, but I knew that because of this background I was building that I could also use this process to help waterproof the bottom as well. So on top of those methods, I also used expanding foam, a sheet of XPS foam, and then more expanding foam around the edges to try and, as best as I could, kind of create this foam layer on the bottom. That also enabled me to be able to shape that foam a little bit to make sure that when water did get introduced to the vivarium that it would run towards the drain. Once that foam was done, I was then able to seal it with the Drylok as well. For the bottom, I used much more than I did for the rest of the walls, just to ensure that it was very much going to be durable and strong enough in the long term to keep that water sealed. The other thing great about this method is that you can fix your mistakes. As you may have seen from that original video, I showed that I had actually done a tree within the middle, like a tree trunk in the background kind of scape. And the idea was that I would have this tree and then I would be able to create branches and buttress roots from it, but it just got too difficult and I just couldn't quite get what I was looking for. So initially I just kept it as a trunk, but it was just one of those things where it was limiting area for the animals to climb because I didn't create those branches and such, and also that I just could see that I could do so much more with it. So basically I decided to get rid of it and just create some more ledges. You can see it's quite grown in right now, so it's hard to see the ledges behind those plants, but maybe I can put a photo here so you can see it a little bit better of that correction. I just took the hammer to it and I knocked away that layer of Drylok that I'd done on the tree, just added more expanding foam, and I just continued the method that I used, and I was able to fix that mistake. And yeah, I'm really much happier with it now. You'll also see that the nest box that was on this side I removed in that video as well. That was one of the mistakes that in the planning I should have known it was not going to work, but you know, sometimes you just have to do things to learn. And this was one of those. By having the large nest box in the top left and then the top bottom, it kind of created too little room within the middle here to add things like these vines and branches and that climbing space. So I decided to get rid of that. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about the life support systems here for this vivarium and how I've managed to get everything tuned in to give the parameters that I need for my animals in this vivarium here. So first off, we have the lights. They provide the lighting and the heating for this setup in the form of two HID lamps. I believe these ones are 70 watts. And then I also have a halogen in there as well, which is about 50 watts, I believe. And basically what these lamps are doing is they generate a nice amount of heat, but in addition to that, the HID bulbs specifically are providing UV light in the forms of UVA, which is more of the visible spectrum, and UVB, which is needed for the absorption of calcium in reptiles. It's becoming more and more accepted that most, if not all, reptiles need some level of UVB, and it's something that I really do feel quite strongly about. It doesn't, when we have the option that we can provide this to our animals, I feel like we should be doing it. So for this setup, I wanted to do that. I really like as well with the HID lamps that the colored temperature is quite naturalistic in terms of daylight. I believe these are 5,000 Kelvin, whereas the halogens are very much, which means they're more on the blue spectrum. The halogen is more on the yellow spectrum. So I believe that the halogens are more around 3,000 Kelvin or so. But having both of them, I like it. It's not just an aesthetic thing though, but yeah, it's cool. And the plants seem to do quite well with this light setup too. It's important that when you're thinking about what heating options you're going to have, that you set them at the appropriate heights and whatnot. That's especially important for the HID lamps. Another thing I want to talk about with the heating and lighting is the fact that I didn't really show how I have them protected in here so that the animals can't burn themselves. Essentially what I've created here is a sort of bulb cage, but not really. So underneath where the lamps are, you can see that I have metal screen, but I have acrylic or plexiglass on the sides of it. Now you might be wondering why I would do that. The main reason is that these are very arboreal animals. If I have mesh screen on the sides of this bulb cage, they're gonna be climbing all over it, and that's not really something that I want them to be doing. There's also an added benefit to that the humidification systems then can't spray any water directly on the lamps. So that's actually turned out quite well in that way, and so far it's working quite good in that the animals tend to be less interested in trying to climb it because of those smoothed edges. Occasionally they will reach up or try to jump up on here, but it's usually quite short-lived. Originally I'd planned to do a kind of false roof or a second roof, so at around this level it would have been screen going all the way across, but in the moments of building the background I just felt like I wanted to give them as much climbing space as I could. So in a sense I've created a second roof, but I've just allowed space behind it on the back wall and then the sides. It's also important too when you're setting up the lamps that you use something like a temperature gun to ensure that you have the angles and everything set up so that the right temperatures are being achieved on the basking sites. Because this is such a big cage and because I was able to create so many layers, my heat gradient is more hot at the top and then it gets cooler as you go down, as opposed to having all of the lamps on one side. It makes more sense for this setup to have it the way I have. So now I've got multiple basking sites at the top level here. And then as they go down, they're able to reach different levels of heat and humidity and such like that as well. It's also good to have the multiple basking sites if you have animals you're keeping communally. So if you're keeping more than one in a cage, then everybody has the opportunity to be basking but not being on top of each other. These guys here don't seem to have any problems basking together. They're often sort of pancaked on each other because they both want the same spot. But oftentimes one will be on the left and one will be on the right or in the middle, and so it's good to provide that kind of choice for your animals. Oh, another really important part of my heating and lighting is that they're not just aimed directly down. So I showed these adjustable sort of lamp fixture things so that you can actually swivel and turn the lamps on a slight degree of different angle sort of thing. That was some good English right there. For the halogens and the HID lamps, you are able to use them in this way without going too far. So I've got HIDs mounted and pointing in a certain direction here, and then another going a different way, and the same with the halogen. Something of note is that I would not use those type of adjustable fixtures for mercury vapor bulbs. Those are a more common sort of heating, basking and UV lamp type, and those are only supposed to be used directly down. So I would not use those type of fittings for this, but for HID and halogen, it works great. So for my lizards that I'm keeping in here, I needed to create a higher humidity environment for them, as they are from a much more humid place than where I currently live now. So for this setup, I had to use a few pieces of equipment to be able to maintain that kind of humidity to keep them happy and healthy. So the way that I've done this is, first of all, I've installed a misting/rain system, so it will periodically spray water into the air of the enclosure, which will help to both raise that humidity, and it also waters the plants a little bit, and the animals themselves really love to drink whenever that turns on. It's quite stimulating for these sort of animals to be drinking water in this way, and so it's a really good addition to have, and I highly suggest having an automated system. It does make your life easier, but I also do some manual misting of the enclosure myself as well. To do this, I just used a beginner Mist King system. They are quite well known for being some of the better misting systems that are out there, and so far I can't really complain about it at all. It's worked really well for my purpose here. Another thing that I decided to use to help maintain that humidity was to create a reptile fogging system out of a room humidifier. I actually made a video on just how to do this, but not only that, but also all of the considerations you need to have in choosing the right humidifier to convert, and just lots of tips and things that I felt like were lacking in the videos here on YouTube on this subject. So if you want to check that out, I will put a link up on the screen now. And of course you can find it on my channel, so feel free to go and check that out, and of course subscribe. But I really enjoy using this system. It's obviously quite cool and makes nice B-rolls for the videos, but in general I have it set quite low, so it's not completely filling up the vivarium with fog. That's a big mistake that I think a lot of people make with these fogging systems. You're not supposed to be kind of fumigating your vivarium. You're supposed to just be adding some humidity to it. So this huge enclosure, I have my room humidifier converted into a reptile fogger, and I have it on a timer, and it's set to the lowest output setting, so it's the bare minimum of what it can push out. Seems to do plenty when set on a timer, and I have it going off multiple times during the day, and also a couple times at night. You can actually see, you might be able to see, it might be hard to pick up on camera, but it's actually on right now. So it's just adding a little bit of moisture extra to the air to help keep that relative humidity at a decent level throughout the day and the night too. So another key element to the life support system here in this vivarium is of course the substrate. So I have coconut fiber mixed with topsoil and sand as the main base for which the substrate is down here. I do add sphagnum moss and dry leaves and things, and leaves from the plants that are actually living in there now will fall and kind of contribute to that substrate mix. And this is kind of creating this this area to hold some moisture, which also helps with the humidity in the enclosure. And within this substrate, there are a lot of creatures. So this is a bioactive setup. So I have a lot of springtails and isopods, earthworms, but it's not something that you can completely rely on in terms of keeping the vivarium clean. You know, this vivarium is very tall as well, and with my animals spending a lot of time up here, they poop a lot up there. So a lot of the time the creatures from below do not really have the opportunity to go up. So for the top area, I tend to have to clean that manually, and some of the poop will obviously fall down as well for then the bioactive creatures to assist with that too. So if we go below that substrate level, we then have the drainage layer. So basically on the bottom, we've got the sealed bottom of the XPS foam that's sealed with Drylok masonry waterproofer. I then have clay balls that are sitting on the bottom that's creating an area for water to pool once it goes through a layer of garden drainage fabric. So as water is introduced to this environment, it will go through the soil, through the garden drainage fabric, and then pool where the clay balls are at the bottom. So this helps the substrate to not become waterlogged, as that is something that you want to avoid. You want soil to be moist, you don't want it to be logged with water. A good way to know if it's like that is if you grab a handful of soil and if you give it a nice squeeze, and if there is a lot of water coming out, then it's probably too wet. But you still want a feeling of moistness, but you don't want it to be just like wringing out a towel that's been dropped in the pool. It's too much water. Because of those humidification systems and all of that water being introduced to create that humid environment, I need to be able to remove that excess water. So that's where having the enclosure on wheels comes into play, as it was then making it possible for me to have a drain installed. I used this using PVC fittings that are normally used for the aquarium hobby. So basically you've got a bulkhead, an L-bend, a ball valve, and then a hose adapter. So that way, whenever I want, I can open the valve and I just take a PVC or silicone tube, I plug it in, and I just take it straight to my bathroom, open the valve, and then I can drain it. That relieves all of the excess water that's in the drainage layer, and then it makes it so the substrate can then have water go back down again. If you leave water in the drainage layer for too long and you're introducing a lot of water, it means that the water won't be able to leave the soil. So you don't want that. You want it to be moist, you don't want it to be logged with water. Okay, now I just want to take a minute to talk about the vine structure that I have in here. So these are custom made jungle vines that I actually made myself. If you are interested in knowing how I made those, I'll put a link on the screen now. You can go and watch that, and that's a full tutorial on how I made those. But I want to take a moment to talk about why I used those, why I decided to make them, and so on. So the main reason was I wanted to be able to have a climbing structure to fill in this space that wasn't the rock walls without it touching the rock walls. So if I had used branches such as cork branches or just cut off branches from whatever tree, then I would have had to have been resting them on the walls, and I just didn't want to do that. I wanted something that was independent from the rock walls. I didn't want to set them in the walls. I wanted it to be separate, and that I could always change it or mix it up as I went. I did try the branch route at first, but it just didn't look good. It was annoying, and I had to figure something out. So this is what I came up with. And so what I did here was I made the vines in many different thicknesses, and that's enabled me to create this real depth to the cage and this layered kind of entangled jungle feel in combination with the live plants. I mean, I think it looks great. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. These vines, they have their own wire structure inside, so they can be twisted and bent and moved to the shape that I want, and it's worked really well. The vines also give structure and places for these plants to grow up higher and feel supported, and that's a good segue into the next part, is the live plants I have in here. So yes, these are live plants. I've got 3 species of plants in here. So the main 2 that I have are 2 varieties of ficus. So we've got Ficus benjamina, or weeping fig, which is a really popular plant in the reptile keeping hobby. It was not this tall when I first got it. It was maybe about this height. Maybe, actually no, that looks too high on the camera. About this height here, about halfway. And it's really grown and done exceptionally well in here. And as you can see, it is also hiding a lot of the rock work, but this particular side is probably the side that I'm the least happy with in terms of the carving and everything. So it kind of works out. So on the right side, I've got another species of ficus called Ficus ali, or bamboo ficus. The advantages of using these ficus species are they are really hardy. Like, these lizards are just so active. They're like little bulldozers, you know. I've had other plants in here such as Monstera and such, and they have just plowed through those. Whereas the ficus species seems to be able to put up with the constant harassment by the lizards, but it's still able to grow and flourish and do really well. They do fine under this type of lighting. This is not exceptionally special lighting for plants, but they are growing a lot. I also have golden pothos in here, but it's a little bit hard to see. The ficus has kind of taken over, but the pothos is kind of living in the bottom area down here, and it's finding little pockets of light, and it's making its home down there, and it's also doing quite well too. That's another species that is quite well known to be doing well with reptiles too. There's a lot of advantages to using the live plants. You know, they are great for maintaining a humidity level in a vivarium. They do assist in that way, as well as, you know, as they drop leaves, especially with these lizards, you know, kind of harassing them and running through them all the time, that kind of creates a nice culture and things for the cleanup crew, the bioactive creatures such as the isopods and the springtails, to live and enjoy that kind of substrate layer, as you want to keep a nice healthy population of that, as that will also help to keep the cage clean. And another crucial element to any animal vivarium is how you provide water for drinking. As I mentioned, the misting systems that I have installed here, they will spray the cage multiple times a day, and the animals do like to drink from that. But of course, you want to be giving your animals fresh, clean water in like a pool or a cup or whatever. You know, it's important that they have that too. I created these cup holders just using some of the garden wire, and I got some small Tupperware containers, so I'm actually able to have a suspended water cup. And I've actually made a couple of these, and I won't just use them for water, I can use them for food as well. Just to show a little bit of how the life support systems in terms of the actual equipment goes, we'll take a quick look on the roof here so I can give you a little tour of that too. So as you can see, I've got two ballasts which are for the HID lamps. So these are something that is necessary for this type of lamp to work. So I've got one each for those. I also have a separate halogen holder there that does not need a ballast, so that just goes straight into the power. And then I also have the you can see the bulkheads and the line for the misting system, as well as the humidifier, and where the humidifier adds water to the vivarium. You can see I have the power boards up here, and they're organized in a way that's relatively clean and easy to see what is what. And I also have timers here for the lamps and the humidifier system. My misting system is actually not placed on the top of this. I have the line running to the other side of my room where my misting system is sitting on a rack, which is where the reservoir of water and the pump and controller are located. A question that popped up a few times in the comments from that original video was how much it costed to build this, and also the time it took. These are very difficult questions to answer because this was such an ongoing project for me. The main enclosure build only took a day, but tuning in all of the things like getting the vents in, you know, creating the vines, the rock wall, God, that was taking so long and so much time carving and recarving and painting and time between layers and all that fun stuff. It's really hard to equate it to an actual amount of time. It took a lot of afternoons, weekends, days off, and that, you know, a lot of spare time to put into this. And as far as money goes, I don't have the exact amount, but you know, for a vivarium this size and everything, it's going to depend so much on where you live as well, and how much materials cost where you are from. It was a lot of money, but you know, it was a passion project for me, and it wasn't about the money. You know, a lot of people spend far too less money on their vivariums and all the money on animals. And for me, I don't want to just keep as many animals as possible. I want to keep an amount of animals that I can manage myself and be happy with and give them as much time and attention as I need, and to keep them in large vivariums that are enriching not just to the animals but to myself as well. The other element when it comes to the time and money is that this was a learning project. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, and I of course ended up wasting certain amounts of materials and such because I didn't quite get it right the first time on many of the little elements that go into building something like this. Alright guys, I want to give you some tips on if you decide you want to build something like this setup here, or just a vivarium project in general. I know a lot of you are probably finding this video and my build video because you're interested in doing something like this, but you're looking for some inspiration or some ideas or just help in that way. So I'm going to try and give you a couple of tips right now as a bonus for this video. So the first tip that I would give is to just research the specific animals that you're going to do for this. You want to keep that as the priority in terms of what you are trying to achieve and what you need to be giving for those animals to thrive. You're not trying to just make a pretty box for them to be in. You want it to be pretty, but you want it to be functional too. The second tip, which kind of is just a continuation of the first, is that you want to do your best to plan your project, get all that research done, but then at some point you just have to give it a go. It can be really difficult and daunting to take on a project like this, but the thing is, you just learn so much by just doing it yourself, and I feel like it's a really important thing to do, to challenge yourself, to try new things. I have not built a vivarium of this scale and complicated needs, and you know, I made mistakes along the way, and although the videos that I've done are showing it to be looking kind of easy, it always looks easy when you see a video like this. There was a lot of there was a lot of pain, tears, blood, all kinds of things that went into building this and producing this video too, you know, and there is such a rewarding thing to being able to say that you created this. I sit here in my living room sometimes and I glance over at my cage and it's hard to believe that it was just an idea in your head and then you went and did it. So it's something that I really wish that more people felt enabled to actually try and maybe build something for themselves and to build something bigger and greater for their animals. My next tip is, if you're building a pretty big cage, put it on wheels. You do not want a big, heavy cage that is sitting flat on your living room floor or wherever you're deciding to keep it. Put it on wheels, save yourself a lot of heartache and pain in your back specifically, but yes, put it on wheels. And also when you're building your enclosure, make sure you measure all your doorways and such so that you are able to remove or move that enclosure if you ever need to. Alright everybody, I really hope that this video has answered all of your questions and has helped you feel inspired to maybe want to build something for yourself too. Like I said before, it's something that I really wish and think that most people should give it a go. If they're in this hobby, you'll get a lot out of building something yourself and you'll probably save a lot of money too. I just want to thank everybody so much for watching the content, subscribing, and just overall giving me great comments and letting me know that what I'm contributing so far is something that's valued to you guys. And that's the reason I made this video, is for all those people that really wanted more and didn't quite get it from that first upload to the channel. So thank you to all of you. I feel like I have a lot to offer and I've got a lot of content on the way, and I would really appreciate if you all keep watching, and if you haven't subscribed already, to do that as well, and just stay tuned. I've got a lot of big exciting things. If you like reptiles, animals, vivariums, zoos, all of that good stuff, you're gonna love this channel. I hope that you'll join me in the next one. Subscribe!